welcome to the next episode, in fact, the inaugural episode in terms of our recording of Better Place. It's what we've decided to call this series of conversations with international law practitioners. Better Place, real world international law. Today we have Yvette Zegenhagen with us, the head of International Humanitarian Law of Australian Red Cross. Yvette has been working in International Humanitarian Law. We're going to call that IHL from now on, I think. IHL for about 10 years or so with the Australian Red Cross, a stint beforehand at the International Committee of the Red Cross in Geneva. And before that, you were even a commercial lawyer specialising in litigation at a major Australian law firm. I think that might have been your first real job after graduating from a law school, but we can hear about that a little bit. You also do some amazing volunteering with the Australian Red Cross aside from your paid work, including, I believe, as a humanitarian officer looking into immigration detention programs, in particular Manus and Christmas Island. So hopefully we can hear a little bit more about that amazing volunteering that you're doing as well. So Yvette, welcome.
Thank you. Thanks very much for having me.
It's our pleasure. So I've just done the formal introductions. I was wondering how you introduce yourself.
Oh, that's a good question. I think as a bit of an IHL nerd, at times I would describe myself as a bit of a failed lawyer. Couldn't hack it in the commercial world, and I guess now not really a lawyer in the sense of, taking on clients and giving legal advice, but more of in a broader legal education policy influencing type role. So I'm not sure failed lawyer is the most positive way of describing myself, but
I don't think anyone else that knows you would.
Accurate.
Oh, no. All right, and just a little bit of the personal Yvette as well as the professional. What's your favourite ice cream flavour?
Oh, that's a tough one. It has to be something with chocolate in it, like triple chocolate with chocolate fudge and chocolate chips, and just death by chocolate, probably.
Okay.
Yeah.
You like chocolate?
Yes. Yeah. Is there some psychological insight that you're trying to glean from people's
I think it's going to be fascinating. I can see the article now, the ice cream flavoured choices of international legal practitioners, psychoanalysts. Fantastic. Yvette, so I sort of shared again the highlights of your professional CV, but was there a particular moment that kicked you off on your journey in international law?
I was very lucky, like a lot of people. There's not a really clear career path into, well, I don't know about other areas of international law, but certainly not IHL. So I was very lucky in that an opportunity came up as I was looking to move into a different area of law and out of commercial litigation. So it was more opportunistic, taking on a short maternity leave contract in the IHL program at Australian Red Cross, and then just trying to make myself as indispensable as possible. And I've hung around like a bad smell ever since. But I think what really drove me to it was actually far more personal. It was more that, so I had always had an interest in it, in that my grandparents had come to Australia as refugees and had been Holocaust survivors, and my grandmother in particular had started her law degree in Switzerland just before the war broke out, and had wanted to do international law, and was cut short, and then towards the end of the war was marched out of a camp and fell into a coma in a barn, and the first thing she saw when she woke up was people running around with red crosses on them,
wow.
Basically nursing her back to life. So I think the Red Cross and what it means for me, and the way in which laws have both failed people but also developed and improved over time, was very dear to my heart. And I felt that having now then had the opportunity to grow up in Australia and pursue an education in ways that she couldn't, and others around the world can't. It was a nice way sort of coming full circle and seeing how we can use the laws of war in better ways than we have in the past.
Yeah, a beautiful story. We've mentioned now international humanitarian law, and you've just mentioned laws of war. I was just wondering if we just wanted to unpack what that area of international law is.
Yeah, sure.
In 25 words or less. No.
The elevator pitch for IHL. So it is often referred to as the laws of war. So it tries to do two main things. It protects people who are not or no longer part of the fight. So that can include, people often think immediately civilians, but they were the last people to get formal protections under these laws. It also covers people like prisoners of war, military wounded and sick, military, religious and medical personnel. So a large group of people that aren't taking part in the fight. And it also places limits on the types of ways in which wars can be fought. So war, despite what you see on the telly, is not a free-for-all from a legal perspective. There are limits placed on how they can be fought.
Yeah. So I've got two follow-up questions. What does this Australian Red Cross, for many people listening to this, might think of the blood bank, might think of assistance to bushfire victims or flooding victims. What does the laws of war have to do with the Australian Red Cross?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we are often known as Bloods and Floods, but actually the laws of war are at the very heart and soul of the Red Cross and Red Crescent movement all around the world. So the founder of the Red Cross, his big idea was that there should be limits placed on the way wars are fought, and he created the first committee of the Red Cross in Geneva, and lobbied for many of the heads of Europe at that time to sign the first Geneva Convention, which is really the cornerstone kind of building blocks of IHL. And from there, what's really interesting, this is where I say I am an IHL nerd in all senses of the term. What's really interesting is international law is usually about how states relate to each other and their conduct towards each other. And IHL certainly does that, but it's also about individual responsibility, and it puts the Red Cross movement into international legal documents. So the Red Cross is named in international treaties, the Geneva Conventions, and gives them a particular role to play in armed conflict. And through there are other international legal frameworks that set out a very clear role for 192 national societies around the world, including us, to promote the laws of war in our own countries. And the idea is that it's the basis upon which we were built over 155 years ago around the world. But in order for people to respect and adhere to the laws of war in times of conflict, they need to understand them and know about them in times of peace. So in an Australian context, that's the approach we take. Obviously, for many national societies that are working in situations of armed conflict, the role they play is quite different to what we do here.
And laws and war, let me just, the elephant in the room. What the hell? Isn't war anything goes? I mean, you mentioned already, on the television, there are atrocities, there are wars, there are conflicts going on, even as we speak. A lot of, not even disrespecting, just not knowing the laws of war. So what's the point of having these international law rules signed by a bunch of men in Geneva?
White men in Geneva.
Yeah.
It wasn't the most diverse start to the movement. So I think it's a really good question. And I certainly don't sit here and profess that the laws of war solve all our problems and create this utopia situation in armed conflict. It is the darkest situation you can find on the planet is a conflict zone. So what they seek to do is they put baseline and minimum standards in place. And that's not to say that everyone complies with them, but I challenge you to find any law where every citizen complies with them. I mean, we've got people that are in jail for tax fraud and all sorts of things. So there's no thinking of the law as a panacea for any problem, I think is flawed. what we need to do is say, okay, well, what norms do they set for most people? So I think and one of the issues we have in IHL is that people deciding not to harm civilians, or a military decision not to target a hospital, they are made every day, but they're not what makes it onto the news. So I think often when laws are working, we don't hear about them because they just hum away in the background. It's when the laws are broken in any set of laws that we start to hear about them. So I would say they're not perfect. They don't fix everything, but we need to keep in mind that we are far better off with them than without them. And for those that do have to rely on them day in, day out for their own protection, they would certainly argue that they still play a really important role. But I think they're one of any number of tools in a toolbox in terms of trying to create those glimmers of humanity in a very, very complex and traumatic situation.
And are there sort of like major challenges that you've got your eye on in terms of creating more of those glimmers of humanity in conflict zones, which is a really beautiful sort of way to look at it? Are there sort of challenges to the implementation or the realization of IHL in today's conflicts?
Yeah, I think there's a number of them, and some of them they present challenges but also potentially opportunities. And I think a good one to describe that is the way in which new technology is being used in conflict. So weapons that are becoming more and more autonomous. So you're taking human decision making out of the weapon systems. So on the one side, that creates a real challenge, because how do you hold people accountable if something goes wrong? How do you preserve that kernel of human responsibility and accountability when you're having to make decisions, literally life and death decisions? On the flip side, they're able to respond very quickly. They're able to be very precise in the way that they're used. So perhaps there's also opportunity to limit the amount of civilian harm that is created with more precise autonomous systems. So they're really complex issues we have to grapple with as they evolve. Cyber warfare is another one. I think the other thing that's really difficult, and I don't think there's any clear solution to this, is that wars, first of all, are protracted. So it's not like they're over in 5 years. People grow up and are born and live their entire lives in conflict zones. They're spanning decades. They're often in urban and densely populated areas, so it's very hard to distinguish between military objectives and civilian objectives, and the impact on civilian infrastructure is massive. And the other thing is that the types of people that are fighting in conflicts are becoming more and more complex. So, and the types of people working in armed conflict is becoming more complex. There's more businesses and private companies that are providing a range of different services in armed conflict. Foreign fighters, so people that, jump on a plane in Sydney and end up in Syria, for example, fighting wars. There's fragmentation of armed groups that might not necessarily know that IHL exists or don't think that it speaks to them and relates to their own moral codes and perspectives on the world. So how do we, the strength of IHL in the past has been that it's really been something where everyone can see themselves and their own values enshrined in them, regardless of your religion, your culture, your background. And that's starting to be challenged a bit. So how do we talk about IHL in a way that resonates with someone, whether you are in a state armed forces or whether you are a foreign fighter from Europe that's joined ISIS? They're very different conversations we have to have in order to maintain that baseline of humanity.
Oh, that's fascinating. That's an amazing list of challenges and opportunities, and also I think really interesting reflection that some of those larger sort of conceptual challenges about the claim of universal truth that lies at the heart of IHL norms, and that being sort of critiqued and assailed by various forces. and rising to that challenge is something that's perhaps reflective of the broader sort of global conversations that we're having at the moment. Fascinating. So if I may switch back to the personal, what keeps you going, Yvette, as an individual? Like, you just presented an amazing array of challenges and, yes, opportunities. So there is bottle half full and bottle half empty, I guess, depending on one's perspective. But how do you keep that perspective? How do you keep going in the face of so much suffering, in particular, and disrespect of your area of international law?
So I would say that I have a much easier job talking about the laws of war in Australia than my colleagues do when they're, in the International Committee of the Red Cross, when they're trying to get access to detention facilities in, any number of conflict zones around the world. So first of all, I'm very conscious that I have a very privileged position in terms of how I get to talk about and use the laws and think about the law from the comfort of Australia. So there's no hardship there that I'm having to grapple with every day. I think for me, I think you have to be at your core a bit of an optimist. And I don't think you want to be naive, but I think you've got to be a glass half full and feel that at its core humanity is good, and that it is worth the effort, and that you're not just speaking into a void. I think one of the things we've tried to do at Australian Red Cross is really focus our efforts in areas where we feel like that we can have a tangible impact. So looking particularly at Australians that and how we influence Australians that either interpret, apply the law, so decision makers and government, or the judiciary, but also
and military officials.
Yep, and military. Yep. But also people that have boots on the ground in conflict zones. So just because we're in Australia doesn't mean that we have no ties to armed conflict around the world. If you look at, for example, the extractive industry, or our military, or our fairly large humanitarian sector in Australia, there are a number of Australians that are operating in conflict settings. So how do we really influence them and focus on their behaviour and their perceptions of what IHL is, and how do we embed that into their thinking when they're then deployed into those sorts of situations? So keeping it, I think, relevant and focusing on the impact, the end impact that we want to see, keeps us going. But I also think I get to work with a fabulous group of people with, I have a wonderful team. I'm connected into an incredible movement, 191 other national societies around the world, the International Committee of the Red Cross, and we've got over 150 volunteers in our program as well, who bring an incredible depth of expertise and knowledge to this. So I think also just the richness of conversations and expertise and knowledge that we're able to gather and work with to pursue our objectives is really invigorating and really inspiring.
What career accomplishment are you most proud of? So many folks in international law, we don't blow our own trumpets too often, and we don't reflect on the past. I feel like you're also not just optimistic, but always future looking. But yeah, let me push you to think about, what is Yvette Zegenhagen's proudest accomplishment, big or small, whatever it might be, in a professional sense?
I'm struggling, not because I'm trying to sift through lots of them. I'm trying to think of more. So I think there's one, I guess, from my professional perspective at Red Cross, and one from my volunteering one. One's very policy driven, one is very operational. So I guess from where I sit as the head of IHL, it's actually not related to IHL per se. It's more about the way in which we are trying to make the movement more inclusive and diverse. So the movement, when I say the movement, it's all the national Red Cross and Red Crescent societies, the International Federation of the Red Cross, that is our sort of governing body, and the International Committee of the Red Cross come together every 2 years to develop institutional or movement-wide policy and positioning on things. And one of the meetings, it became very apparent that through a number of elections that were held, that there was still an incredible lack of diversity within the movement, particularly from a gender perspective. So I was able to work with sort of a core team of 2 other people, one from Sweden, one from the International Committee of the Red Cross, to draft up a resolution that was then put to the entire movement, that provided a concrete commitment to increase gender equality at all levels of the movement, and within all components of the movement, including the highest decision-making body, which is called the Standing Commission. So obviously gender is only one type of diversity, but I think it has opened the door to a lot of broader discussions across the movement about how we truly make ourselves open for all people, how we harness what should be our greatest strength, which is our diversity, in ways that are really meaningful, and bring ourselves well and truly into the 21st century. So that was something I was really proud of, because I can see that it's actually making a difference and there are changes happening. So that was great. And from a volunteering perspective, I should say I don't want to overstate my volunteering with the Immigration Detention Monitoring Team. I'm not reading too much into it, but I haven't been asked to go on one of their visits for probably about a year and a half now. So I think, you know, my time with that program isn't as recent as a lot of others. But one of the things that I think I will always remember, again, as someone who's had extended family find people through the Red Cross tracing service, is doing a detention visit on Manus Island and delivering a tracing message to a gentleman in the detention facility who did not know if his wife and children had reached Australia safely. They'd been separated on different boats. And I was able to tell him not only had they made it safely, they'd been released into the community, and I was able to give him his children's school reports and school photos, and he hadn't seen them at that point for several years. So that, amazing, I think, will always stay with me.
Yeah, and you mentioned beautiful. You mentioned the word tracing. Some folks listening to this may not quite understand that, but the Red Cross has for decades been involved in relinking families during and after war, and allowing family members to work out what has happened to other family members. That's the tracing service?
Yes. And again, very, very genesis of the Red Cross movement, and built in as I guess built into the Geneva Conventions and obligations under those treaties.
Yeah, really beautiful, and just that's not really a law thing, as you said, but it's a glimmer of humanity, isn't it?
It is, and I think again, it's not the law that, you know, I don't go, you know, we don't go to Manus Island on the basis of a legal document, but actually it's the role that the law has played in developing that obligation of or that right of families to know the fate of their loved ones, the role of the Red Cross under international legal frameworks to facilitate that. So the law is there as a bit of an invisible tool, along with other things, that allows us to then do that kind of work. So what I love about IHL is that, yes, I'm often very much in the policy education space, but there's no doubt in my mind that this is a very practical set of laws that people take, and you don't go parroting off, you know, particular sections of the Geneva Conventions, but on a very basic level, they translate into very practical action.
Beautiful. All right, let me take you to the macro level. There's 2 questions on that. Does international law work?
Well, I would say yes, because I think it would be hugely demoralizing to think that I am giving my professional life to something that doesn't. I don't think it always works well, but I think it is the best that we've got, and it's our job to build up and highlight the bits that are working, and to ensure that its validity and its credibility isn't eroded to the point where it stops working, but to also critically examine the bits that don't work and to be brave and courageous in thinking about how we fix them. And the Red Cross can only do that so much. We're not the ones that own the law. It's governments and, it's states that need to do that. And there are swings and roundabouts with, geopolitics in terms of the appetite to do that. But I think there are certainly things you can point to that don't work well or could work better. We're not working in a perfect world. We have to be pragmatic, but part of our job at the Red Cross is to keep poking and prodding and pushing for some of those things to improve.
And a little bit of crystal ball gazing. For the next, what do you think what's the future of international law, for our kids and our grandkids? What does international law look like in 25 years?
Yeah, I think it'll be, I don't know. It's so hard to tell. If I was being really bold and ambitious, well, not even ambitious, if I was being a bit out there, I would say that we should look at the role of cities as well as states and what that means for international law. Even if you look at, the way that in Australia, but also in the US, the role of state governments has played in responding to coronavirus, for example. It's been really prominent. So what will happen with the rise of cities and leaders in cities that want to shape things that link into international law? I think also in terms of thematic areas, I reckon climate change and space are the two areas that are going to really require a lot of thought and development and could really shift the way we think about international law.
Yeah, fantastic.
Or we could be here in 20 years and it's exactly the same as it is now.
Elon Musk won't let us be in the same position in 20 years. I think we might be thinking of interplanetary law in 20 years' time, perhaps, if he gets his way. All right. Well, let me just round off then, if I may, get back to the personal, Yvette, and your personal journey in international law. I was wondering if you have a favourite international law moment from the past, something that just, you reflect on it and it just makes you smile.
Oh, that's such a good question. I'm going to need to think about it. That's such a good question.
My follow-up isn't any easier.
I think so. Is it one that I've been alive for, or one?
No. Just you're a well-studied person. You know the history of international law. We spoke a lot about bottle half full. I assume some of what gives you that hope is some moments in the past.
So I think I guess as Australians, we always back the underdogs, right? So I like the stories where there was sort of, will it, won't it work? And ultimately, the law has developed and succeeded in spite of what people might have thought would happen. So I guess there would be two in particular, I guess and they're fairly recent, to be honest, but one would be the establishment of the International Criminal Court. So having had friends and colleagues who were part of those negotiations and just describing the feeling in the room and looking up at this board that would show sort of the name of the country with a red light or a green light as to whether or not they were going to support the Rome Statute, and thinking, this may not get up and then just seeing this sea of green lights. I think, without being in the room, hearing those experiences just kind of gives me chills.
Yeah.
So that would be one. And a similar one would be the nuclear weapons treaty that was negotiated in the UN General Assembly just a couple of years ago. So who would have thought in a world where people are backing away from multilateralism, where nuclear weapons are still seen as so politicized and so linked into national security, that you would have over 100 countries that are just voting in support of a treaty to ban nuclear weapons. Just phenomenal. And I just think, you know what, if we can chip away at something like that, then anything is possible.
So those are two events that are some of your inspiration. I'm wondering about people. Do you have any heroes, international law heroes, that you draw inspiration and energy from?
I do, but I think I would embarrass a couple of them by naming them. So I think, so one of the things I love about being part of the movement is that I am constantly surrounded by people that are way smarter than me, that are grappling with really wicked IHL problems on a daily basis, but at their core never lose that humanitarian softness I think that you need to think about the law in a way that places people in armed conflict at the center of your thinking and the center of your decision making around how you apply the law. So I don't know if there's any one person that I would single out, but I would absolutely say that there are particularly a number of women within the Red Cross movement that I watch who have dedicated decades of their lives to this area of law, and I think it's their collective impact that I look at and think that is a girl gang I would like to be a part of. So,
yeah.
And I think, if you look at the ICRC at the moment, they've got their first female and first non-Swiss director of international law in their 155-year history.
Who happens to be
Australian. So I think, so that's Dr. Helen Durham, and she's someone that I think has inspired not just me, but generations of Australian law students and legal practitioners to go into the law, and the team that she has built around her as well, and across the movement, the legal advisors in other national societies. I think it's that collective effort and that collective, not just brain power, but compassion that I find really inspiring, that I like to be able to draw upon.
Beautiful. You did mention one name, despite your reticence. Last chance on that.
Only
any other shout outs to individuals, heroes of yours? I don't think they'd be embarrassed. I think they would be wonderfully humbled and chuffed.
Look, I think there's a number of them. Even, I mean, I'm not going to say Henry Dunant, but I think
you have now the obligatory Red Cross. You have mentioned his name by name in a Red Cross interview. Well done.
Exactly. But certainly the foresight that was, and the vision of the people that established the movement is something that's quite inspiring. The lawyer that was part of the first committee of the Red Cross predicted that there would be a need for some sort of international criminal court to enforce IHL, 100 years before the International Criminal Court was established. That's pretty impressive. I also like, and I wouldn't call them heroes, but I really feel that there are a number of people in the IHL space who come at this with very different perspectives from me, and who think about the law very differently. But I draw a lot of, I guess, intellectual curiosity and determination from hearing the way they approach the law, and thinking about ways that I can then creatively think about things in my own mind as well. But I don't think there's a lot of people in IHL that I think are doing brilliant things, and I draw inspiration from all of them. You know, people within my own team, our volunteer base, and I say that with all sincerity. There are a lot of brilliant minds that pour their efforts into this area of law, and I don't want to place one above the other, because I'm very lucky in that I can look across a huge range of people.
Fair enough. But let the record show that you did put Helen above all others. Yeah, anyway, no, just kidding. A few times in this interview, if I may just go back to something on a more serious topic, you've mentioned gender. And you've mentioned the girl gang that you want to be a part of, that you are a part of in terms of IHL. Has gender and your gender been a hindrance to you pursuing a career in international law?
No, I don't think so at all. So I don't think so, because I've always had strong female role models, female bosses. Actually, one of the things I struggle with in the IHL program is getting gender balance in the IHL team when I'm doing recruitment, because we've got so many more women in our team than men usually. So it's not that it's been a struggle at all. I think within the movement there has been a bit of an issue with women in senior leadership positions, but I think I've mentioned gender a couple of times, but I guess one of the things, again, beyond IHL per se, but just more broadly for the movement, that I'm really passionate about is diversity in all its forms, because I think as a movement and as the world is shifting and changing, we must be as inclusive as possible, because if people don't see themselves in the organisations that they're wanting to join, or that are trying to support them and their families, then we're failing in my view. So I think it's more of a desire to see diversity more generally embedded into the movement. And I don't mean, you know, let's recruit more women, or let's recruit more people from a particular ethnicity. I mean, this is a movement that I love dearly and I hold very dear to my heart, but it has been set up in a very Western construct. And so how do we really acknowledge that and see all the good that it has, but also say, well, that doesn't fit with everyone's view of the world, and how do we actually create systemic change to make sure that we can reflect really deeply the diversity across the world.
Well said. Changing tacks back again. Your best movie, your best movie you've seen on international humanitarian law.
Oh, I thought you were just going to ask for my favourite movie. And
No.
A Disney movie.
Well, come on, tell us your... No, not Frozen, please. Your favourite movie?
Frozen.
Okay, if you want to volunteer that. But your favourite, the best movie you've seen on international humanitarian law. Or sort of, you know, pop culture sort of reference to IHL. Your favourite.
So the one I would say is not actually strictly IHL, but it brings up a lot of related issues that in a very easy way to discuss with people, and that's Eye in the Sky. So not necessarily IHL in the purest sense of the word, but it gives you the opportunity to talk about targeting, about some of the moral issues that might sit behind, you know, targeting your own citizens, for example, the use of technology, and so it's not an armed conflict. So in that sense, it's not an IHL movie, but I do think it's a really good conversation starter. I think one
Alan
of the
Rickman's last movie ever.
Oh, I know, and I love Alan Rickman.
Mm-hmm.
I also I don't know if you've seen Hotel Rwanda.
Oh, many moons ago.
That's a movie that has stuck with me.
Yeah.
Yeah. And if that's not a cry, again, for doing better, and where I guess we see the worst of the human condition, not just from within a country, but from a global community.
Yeah.
And again, the way in which history can, the historical context within a country and a colonial context can manifest and bubble and boil into something, I think is really, quite something.
Cool. Well, we're pretty much out of time. I did just want to ask one final question, I guess, which was if you wanted to just look straight down the barrel, and if you had any advice to students of international law that want to walk in your footsteps and pursue a career in international law, what advice would you give them?
I would say try and be as flexible in your thinking as possible. There is no one direct way into this sector. It's becoming more and more competitive and difficult to get into. So keep a very open mind about what opportunities might present themselves, and don't try and overplan things, because I think you've just got to be able to be nimble and jump on opportunities where you can, and your career path will probably look more like this rather than like this, which is what you would expect if you're going for clerkships and following a career in commercial law or private practice.
Awesome. I have just one final task, Yvette, for you today. It's
Sure.
it's not a question, it's a complete the sentence. Okay?
Okay.
Yeah. International law is
Worth protecting.
Awesome. Thank you. And on that note, I just wanted to thank again Yvette Zegenhagen, Head of International Humanitarian Law at Australian Red Cross. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thanks for having me. Thanks for the great questions.
And we will see you around.
Yep, see you soon.